Hello, I'm Derek Brown, the Operations Manager here at Bentonville Battlefield, and I have the pleasure of introducing the first guest speaker for Bentonville 156, a Carolinas Campaign virtual event. Dr. Chris E. Fonvielle Jr. is a native of Wilmington with a lifelong interest in the American Civil War, North Carolina, and Cape Fear history. After receiving his BA in anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, he served as the last curator of the Blockade runner of the Confederacy Museum. He went on to receive his MA in American History at East Carolina University and his PhD from the University of South Carolina. After a brief teaching stint at ECU, Dr. Fonvielle returned to UNCW in 1996, where for 20 plus years he taught courses in the Civil War, Wilmington, and the Lower Cape Fear and antebellum America. His in-depth research focuses on coastal operations and defenses and blockade running in southeastern North Carolina during the Civil War. His books include the Wilmington Campaign, Last Rays of Departing Hope, Wilmington and the Lower Cape Fear, an Illustrated History, Fort Fisher, 1865, the photographs of Timothy O'Sullivan, and Glory at Wilmington, the Battle of Forts Road. His latest work is Curious Tales from Old Wilmington, where he attempts to find the truth behind local legends. In 2014, he was appointed to the North Carolina Historical Commission, and upon his retirement from UNC Wilmington in 2018, Dr. Fonvielle was presented with the Order of the Lone Leaf Pine for distinguished service to the state of North Carolina. He's now a regular tour guide for Wilmington Water Tours and a featured guest on the Cape Fear Unearthed podcast, and a contributor of articles on Cape Fear history for Salt Magazine. Tonight, he will be discussing the war coming to, or as I would prefer to say, returning to North Carolina in late 1864 and 1865. I'm proud to call him my mentor and my friend. Thank you, Dr. Fonvielle.
Thank you, Derek, for that kind introduction. I miss our time together in the classroom at UNCW, where Derek was my teaching assistant and my graduate student. Well, it's nice to be with you all this evening. We're going to be talking about the Wilmington Campaign, which was the last major coastal operation during the Civil War. The intent of the Union was to close Wilmington, the Confederacy's last major seaport, open to trade with the outside world, and to capture the city itself in support of General William T. Sherman's northern expedition, or what historians now call the Carolinas Campaign, that would culminate, at least here in North Carolina, with the last major showdown at the Battle of Bentonville, where we are tonight. The Confederacy, of course, was trying to hang on to Wilmington because of that maritime trade with Europe, and especially with Great Britain, which was crucial to the survival of the Army of Northern Virginia and to the Confederate government. The lifeline of supplies through Wilmington meant that the Confederacy could live to fight another day. On the eve of the Civil War, Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city and the Confederacy's most important seaport by 1863, and I argue the Confederacy's most important city by 1864. Wilmington's growing importance was due to the Union naval blockade that slowly choked the South from supplies being smuggled into the Confederacy because of President Abraham Lincoln's naval blockade, which he established in the spring of 1861. The Lincoln administration understood that the agrarian South, which lacked the industrial capacity to supply arms and equipment to its armies, would have to trade with European nations, and particularly with Great Britain, to sustain its war effort. So in the spring of 1861, President Lincoln established a naval blockade, which was ridiculed in the press as being an anaconda plan, a reference to a boa that would surround its prey and suddenly strangle it. Winfield Scott, which was a part of this establishment of the blockade, commander of the U.S. Army forces, his plan was ridiculed as Scott's Great Snake Plan. But in the end, it was this policy of blockade and infiltration into the South against strategic political and industrial targets that led to Union victory. Now, there were logistical problems for Lincoln's blockade as well as legal problems. I mean, what exactly was a blockade? It was an act of war between two belligerent nations, but Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. So the European nations turned a blind eye to trading companies that developed that would smuggle supplies into the Confederacy. And when the war began, the U.S. Navy was small. They had to cover almost 3,600 miles of Confederate shoreline from the Virginia Capes to the Florida Keys to the Texas-Mexico border. In short, in the spring of 1861, there were only a dozen steamships to patrol that much mileage. Basically, one steamship to cover every 300 miles of Confederate shoreline. So the blockade was ineffective. Now, most Americans, including Lincoln, thought the war would be over in no more than 90 days or one big battle. But of course, this turned out to be a long and bloody war. In fact, the blockade was not even established at Wilmington until July of 1861, 90 days after the war had begun. The Confederate response to Lincoln's blockade was blockade running. Commerce vessels would attempt to smuggle supplies into Confederate seaports, piercing or running through the cordon of U.S. Navy vessels deployed offshore. Wilmington became increasingly important because it was close to neutral transshipment points like Bermuda, Nassau in the Bahamas, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Wilmington was not yet the most important Atlantic seaport for the Confederacy. That was Charleston, but slowly but surely, as other seaports fell into Union hands or effectively blockaded, Wilmington took on greater significance. For example, New Orleans fell in April of 1862. New Orleans, of course, controlled the mouth of the Mississippi River, or the father of all waters. By the spring of 1862, Union Army and Naval forces had captured and now controlled 2/3 of North Carolina's coastal plain, Albemarle, Pamlico Sound, as well as the Outer Banks. So the policy was to capture these strategic points along the coast, and Wilmington would be the next target in North Carolina. And then you knock down the seaports akin to a game of dominoes. But instead of going after Wilmington, which should have been the Federals' next target, they hopscotched over the seaport and went after Charleston instead. Symbolically, of course, that is where it took on great importance. That's where the war began. That was the nest of the secessionists. So Union efforts, manpower, resources were put at Charleston beginning in the spring of 1863, and Charleston did not fall. In fact, Charleston underwent the longest siege of the Civil War, much to the chagrin of the Lincoln administration, the War Department, the Navy Department, but to the benefit of companies that traded through the blockade. So companies that had traded at Charleston, these importing, exporting firms, transferred their operations 175 miles up the coast to Wilmington, which by then became the largest major seaport close to the Virginia battlefront, which was a major theater of war. Geography played a very important role in the success of blockade runners at Wilmington because there were two entry points into the harborway. Old Inlet at the mouth of the river, and then 6 miles to the northeast as the crow flies was New Inlet, separated by Bald Head Island and a line of shoals at the Cape Fear called Frying Pan Shoals. The distance between them on the outside for Union blockaders was about 40 miles. So as one Union naval officer said, we were like a parcel of cats watching a rat hole, and you never knew which hole the rat was going to use. And just about the time that you covered one hole, the rat would use the other hole. So this was literally a cat and mouse game in trying to intercept blockade runners that were coming and going at Wilmington. And blockade runners for the duration of the war had a tremendous success rate of about 80% at Wilmington. Now, for the first 2.5 years of the war, mostly sailing vessels, schooners, barks, sloops, could be used as blockade runners because the blockade was ineffective. But as the Union captured Confederate seaports and the United States Navy grew from only 90 vessels to 671 vessels by war's end, that meant that the Navy Department could concentrate a greater number of vessels against fewer number of Confederate seaports. Now, about 106 different steamships operated at Wilmington. In 1865, the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, estimated that there were about 1,600 ships that were employed as blockade runners during the war, about 300 of which were steam vessels. And about 1/3 of those operated at Wilmington, including the Banshee seen here, which made 8 successful runs through the blockade. And these blockade runners, of course, brought in valuable military supplies, firearms and edged weapons and artillery and ammunition, as well as domestic products for civilians, because of course a successful war effort depends on the public supporting the armies and navies. North Carolina was heavily involved in blockade running, owning one vessel called the Advance outright, and profited greatly by the illegal trade. And this was a very risky, potentially dangerous business, but a very lucrative one for blockade running firms and captains and pilots who were good. Wilmington was not only important as an entrepot for goods that were run through the blockade, but it also had good lines of transportation and communication. 3 railroads tapped into Wilmington, the most important of which was the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, which ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, where it connected with the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, and this became a major artery of supplies for General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In fact, it became known by 1864 as Lee's Lifeline, or the lifeline of the Confederacy. So to protect the blockade runners that traded at Wilmington, to protect the increasingly important city, to protect the lines of communication, Confederate engineers built a vast network of forts and batteries to protect those interests. And other than Charleston, Wilmington became the most heavily fortified city along the Atlantic seaboard. Now, the main forts were built at the mouth of the river to provide covering fire for these blockade runners, like Fort Caswell and Fort Holmes at Old Inlet, and at New Inlet, Fort Fisher. But there was a host of other batteries along the strand, the beach strand, and along the riverfront, and even close to Wilmington. So this was a heavily fortified city. Fort Anderson was the largest interior fortification that guarded Wilmington. The main fortification was Fort Fisher, built near New Inlet, which turned out to be the strongest and best armed Confederate seacoast fortification, and was referred to as the Malakoff Tower of the South, in reference to the Malakoff Tower in the Crimean War in the mid-1850s. It was built almost exclusively of sand. There were intermittent cannon chambers that were separated by larger mounds of dirt called traverses to provide protection for the guns and gun crews in the adjoining chambers, and heavily armed with big pieces of seacoast artillery, including this 8-inch, 150-pounder Armstrong rifle gun, which was imported through the blockade on board a blockade runner called the Hope in August of 1864. A beautiful piece of weaponry, and is one of the few guns that have actually survived the battle and now resides at West Point, New York. Commanding Fort Fisher was Colonel William Lamb of Norfolk, Virginia, who took control in July of 1862, but his overall commander for most of the war was Major General W.H.C. Whiting, who commanded the district and later the department of the Cape Fear. General Whiting, by the way, graduated from West Point, the United States Military Academy, class of 1845, with the highest grades of any cadet until Douglas MacArthur graduated about 55 years later. Well, the Secretary of the Navy, U.S. Navy, Gideon Welles certainly understood the growing significance of Wilmington as an entry point for these blockade runners. And he reported, to close the port of Wilmington is undoubtedly the most important and effective demonstration that can be made. If of less prestige than the capture of Richmond, the Confederate capital, it would be as damaging to the rebels. But public and political interest centered on Charleston. And so Wilmington was neglected, and the blockade running trade survived and thrived to the benefit of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. So these blockade runners continued to bring in supplies for Wilmington. By late 1864, Wilmington had grown so important that General Robert E. Lee cautioned military authorities, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. By then, he is in a war of attrition and stalemate around Petersburg with General U.S. Grant's operational forces, the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the James, trying to break through Lee's depleted but strongly entrenched army to capture the second most important city in Petersburg, which would be a launching point for capturing Richmond. So Lee himself made the message was clear from General Lee: if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. Now, the Lincoln administration, the War Department, had not paid much attention to Wilmington throughout the war, but everything changed after Admiral David Farragut closed Mobile Bay, the last seaport open to trade in the Gulf of Mexico, in the largest sea battle of the Civil War on August 5th, 1864. That left Wilmington as the only seaport still open to trade with Europe. So Gideon Welles rushed to the White House to implore President Lincoln to give his blessings for an attack on Wilmington. And Lincoln finally agreed and gave the assault the green light, in large part because it was an election year. The war was not going well for the Union in the summer of 1864. Lincoln had predicted unless the fortunes of war changed for the Union fairly quickly, then he probably would not be returned to the White House. If, on the other hand, Wilmington could be closed to blockade running and the city captured fairly quickly, it might just turn the tide of war in the Union's favor. So he gave the proposed assault on Wilmington the green light, but deferred final approval of it to General Grant, who was not enthusiastic. He wanted more soldiers to put and keep the pressure on General Lee at Petersburg, and the attack on Wilmington would require him to give up an expeditionary force of up to 10,000 men. But at the same time, he understood President Lincoln's political dilemma, because if Lincoln was not reelected, in all likelihood, General Grant would be relieved of duty as commander of U.S. Army forces. So Grant's job also depended on Lincoln's reelection. So he agreed to give up troops for an expeditionary force to go after Wilmington when the time was right. In the meantime, now with this tacit approval of a campaign to close Wilmington to blockade running, the fall of the city would be incidental, but the purpose was to close Wilmington to the blockade running trade. The Navy Department debated whether to give Admiral Farragut, who had captured New Orleans and had closed Mobile Bay, the command of the North Atlantic blockading squadron, but exhausted from all the campaigning in the Gulf, he declined, and the Navy Department instead offered the command to Farragut's foster brother, Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, who was tough as hide leather, and gentlemen, this is the guy that you would want by your side in a barroom brawl. He was one tough customer. So he very quickly organized the largest fleet of the Civil War, of 150 warships in the North Atlantic blockading squadron. Porter assembled 64 of them specifically for a naval task force that would focus on Fort Fisher. General Grant appointed Major General Godfrey Weitzel to command the expeditionary force that would accompany the Navy. The attack would be led by the Navy, but the expeditionary force, the Army's expeditionary force, would be commanded by Major General Godfrey Weitzel, Grant's hand-picked commander. He was the former engineer in the Army of the James. But the territory, the Union Department of Southeastern Virginia and North Carolina, was commanded by Major General Benjamin F. Butler, who intercepted all of Grant's memos going to Weitzel. In fact, Weitzel later claimed that he never knew that he had been appointed commander of the Expeditionary Force. And in effect, Butler took command of the Army in this proposed assault to close Wilmington to blockade running. The problem was that Butler and Porter disliked each other intently. Maybe dislike is not a strong enough term. They hated each other, and it went back to their campaigning together in New Orleans in 1862, where Butler had been critical of Porter's flotilla of vessels in the attack on the Crescent City, and they simply disagreed on a matter of strategy and tactics, and their relationship soured. In his memoirs, Butler later wrote that Admiral Porter hated me like the devil hates holy water. So here are the two major commanders of their respective branches who are supposed to cooperate, work harmoniously together to close the last seaport open to trade with Europe, and they hate each other. They're barely speaking to each other. So this does not bode well for a successful campaign. Politics of command haunted the Confederate side. General Whiting had a reputation for being difficult, frustrated in that he thought that his talents would best be used in the field in command of a division or maybe even a corps fighting in Virginia. And allegedly began drinking out of frustration. So he had a reputation with Governor Zebulon Vance and with the hierarchy in Richmond for being unreliable. So in the 11th hour, where Wilmington was so important to the survival of the Confederacy, General Whiting was removed from command by President Jefferson Davis and replaced by General Braxton Bragg, arguably the most hated general officer in the Confederacy. This was a very controversial field commander who had a reputation for being, quote, not a fighting general. And he is sent to Wilmington in late October of 1864 when the threat against Wilmington is very serious. The Richmond Enquirer and other media outlets caught wind of the new assignment of General Bragg, and the Richmond Enquirer in October of '64 pointed out that Braxton Bragg has been ordered to Wilmington. Goodbye, Wilmington. That's the lack of faith that the Confederacy had in Braxton Bragg, and yet he is going to be responsible for the defense of the most important city in the Confederacy. I say that because the seat of government could have been moved from Richmond to Danville or Greensboro or Charlotte, as it had been from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond in the spring of 1861. Wilmington, however, so important that General Lee himself said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. Well, the campaign did not get underway until early December of '64, and by then, the political aspect of the operation had been negated because Lincoln was reelected in November. After the closure of Mobile in early August. That was followed by General William T. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in early September, and General Phil Sheridan's successful scorched earth campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, denying General Lee's army supplies from that important sector. So the Northern public began to see that there was light at the end of the tunnel, and President Lincoln, of course, was determined to see the war concluded on the battlefield, not at the negotiation table, as Democrats were willing to do. Soldiers also wanted what they called a soldier's peace. When asked by a reporter what a soldier's peace was, the soldier replied, "You fight until one side is whipped, sir. That is a soldier's peace. We don't want a politician's peace." So Lincoln is reelected because he is determined to end the war on the battlefield. One of the key features of the first attack at Fort Fisher was General Butler's idea of loading a steamship, the USS Louisiana, which had been a patrol boat in the sounds of North Carolina early in the war, with upwards to 300 tons of gunpowder. The idea is that the vessel would be run ashore as close to Fort Fisher as possible, and then the gunpowder exploded simultaneously. The idea that the explosion of that much gunpowder, it would create hurricane or tornado force winds strong enough to blow down the sand walls of the fort, and then would allow the Union Expeditionary Force to enter for mop-up operations. While it sounded like a wild scheme, there was some precedent for the destruction of nearby structures by the explosion of a large amount of gunpowder. General Butler's engineers thought it was worth trying. The naval engineers thought it was a ridiculous idea, but even President Lincoln said, you know, if we're going to explode this notion with gunpowder, then we may as well do it, as long as it gets the expedition going. Even Admiral Porter was cautiously optimistic that this thing might work. And so early on the morning of Christmas Eve, 1864, the USS Louisiana was exploded off of Fort Fisher and had no detrimental effect to the fort whatsoever. Colonel Lamb was told that it was a blockade runner that had run aground and set herself on fire and blew up rather than be run aground or captured by U.S. Navy vessels. Those sailors on board ships that had been taken offshore to prevent any potential damage to their boilers, sailors said, well, that was a dud, or they referred to it as Butler's folly or Butler's toy. So now the real operation began with the bombardment of Fort Fisher over a 2-day period in what became the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War. 64 warships bombarded this massive sand fortification, and the Confederates replied only sporadically because of a lack of gunpowder and ammunition. But the Union warships concentrated their fire on the Confederate flags rather than in an attempt to destroy or dismantle all of the artillery along the land front that would enable the Union Army to attack. And Colonel Lamb saw what was going on, moved the flags to the back of the fort, and the fire of the fleet was redirected to the positions of the flags close to the river. And Colonel Lamb later wrote that at least 1/3 of all the U.S. Navy projectiles thrown at his fort went over it and into the marsh or river behind it, and it was the biggest waste of gunpowder in the annals of warfare. General Weitzel, still not knowing that he commanded the Expeditionary Force, did put ashore about 1/3 of the 6,500 men that had accompanied him on board Army transport vessels, approached the fort on Christmas Day, only to discover that the artillery on the land front that would cover the ground across which the Army would attack had not been damaged or destroyed. And so he recommended to General Butler that the mission be aborted. And Butler, who never set foot on shore, agreed, and the Army's portion of the campaign was aborted, and the Army transports returned to Virginia. That created a firestorm of controversy, as you can well imagine, in the War Department, Navy Department, the Lincoln administration, and in Congress. In fact, there would be a congressional investigation as to the causes of this massive failure after so much time and effort and money went into organizing it. Admiral Porter, believing that his fire from the naval armada had been effective, blamed Butler for the failure. General Butler blamed Admiral Porter for his ineffective fire of the fort, and so it went back and forth, back and forth. But everything changed despite the fact that the Federals lost that first attack on Fort Fisher. There was a concurrent Union victory 225 miles to the south in Savannah. General William T. Sherman, after capturing Atlanta in early September, then mobilized his forces for a march across Georgia in November, capturing Savannah on December the 21st, and in fact presented the city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. For his part, General Sherman was glad to see Sherman on the seacoast and planned to transfer his 60,000-man legion from Savannah up the seacoast to Petersburg for one final major push against General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But General Sherman had other plans. He proposed to march to Virginia through the Carolinas, as he had done so successfully through Georgia, and destroy supplies and railroad depots and capture strategic points until he got to North Carolina. His objective in North Carolina would be Goldsboro. From there, he could go southward to attack Wilmington if necessary, but ideally, when he got to Goldsboro, he'd go right up the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad to attack the underbelly of Lee's army at Petersburg. So while Grant continued to press the attack on Lee from the east, Sherman would be in position to attack Lee's army from the south. And if they could force Lee out into open country, together Grant and Sherman could attack Lee's army and defeat it. Grant was impressed by Sherman's audacious, bold plan and approved it, later saying that he would have entrusted such a movement to no other general officer but William T. Sherman. And so Grant instructed Sherman to begin his northern expedition as quickly as possible. But what Grant wanted to do to assure the success of Sherman's bold movement was to capture a point on the seacoast, halfway between Savannah and Petersburg, from where Grant could send reinforcements to Sherman in the inland and supplies. No one knew at that point what kind of opposition Sherman might face. Would Lee detach a portion of his army to go after Sherman? What other armies in the South would move to coordinate an attack on Sherman? So where was that halfway point that had good lines of communication and transportation? Wilmington. So Grant, indifferent to the attack on Fort Fisher in December of 1864, was now enthusiastic about an attack on Wilmington. By capturing the city and the Cape Fear River, he could use the river and the railroads to reinforce and resupply Sherman if he could make it to the South Carolina-North Carolina line, or ideally make it at least to Fayetteville, which was 90 miles northwest of Wilmington on the Cape Fear River. So, with the Lincoln administration's blessing, General Butler, so controversial, was fired and sent home to Massachusetts, and was replaced with the affable Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, commander of the 24th Army Corps, that would now make up the bulk of the Expeditionary Force. The Federals would return in mid-January, only 2.5 weeks after the failure to capture Fort Fisher in December. Braxton Bragg had failed to use reinforcements that Lee had sent down from Virginia, 6,400 in number, and rather than place them in a position close to Fort Fisher in case the Federals returned, he took them to Wilmington to stage a grand review, a parade for citizens who were appreciative that Braxton Bragg had been victorious in the first battle of Fort Fisher. Braxton Bragg had nothing to do with it, but of course he took credit for it. So a grand review was held on January the 12th. Then Bragg released the soldiers to R&R in downtown Wilmington that night. And then it's Colonel Land at Fort Fisher, who was so fearful, along with General Whiting, who had gone there as a volunteer advisor and combatant, they notified headquarters in Wilmington, 20 miles to the north, that the Federal fleet was back and undoubtedly would come ashore early the next morning, and Braxton Bragg's forces were not in a position to contest the landing. And even General Whiting had said, if the Federal forces establish a beachhead, the fall of Fort Fisher and then Wilmington are but a matter of time. And sure enough, early on the morning of January the 13th, General Terry's forces come ashore, meeting no resistance whatsoever. Among the 9,600 members of the Expeditionary Force, now increased by roughly 3,000, were 2 brigades of the United States Colored Troops. So this was not just a white man's fight. United States Colored Troops, and these were veterans, hardy veterans from fighting in Virginia in 1864, would be a part of what was officially designated General Terry's Provisional Corps. On the 13th, Admiral Porter renewed the bombardment of Fort Fisher in what would become the second largest bombardment of the Civil War. This time, their fire was concentrated on the land front that covered the ground across which the Army might attack, and the destruction of the artillery that protected that ground. And this time, with the practice that they had had in the earlier attack in December, there was pinpoint accurate firing of Admiral Porter's warships against Fort Fisher, and sure enough, the artillery along the land front, with the exception of 1 cannon, were destroyed or dismantled, and casualties inside the fort mounted greatly throughout the attack as the Confederates tried to stand by their guns to return fire, but were forced underground into their bomb proofs. Colonel Lamb said at one moment at the height of the bombardment on January the 15th, he counted 100 exploding projectiles in 60 seconds. There were almost 20,000 shot and shell thrown at his fort in about a 2.5-day period in mid-January. Then a coordinated attack against the fort began late on the afternoon of January the 15th. The United States Army, all of its soldiers gone ashore with General Terry, attacked the west end of Fort Fisher, while on the east end, close to the riverfront, 2,200 U.S. sailors and Marines, volunteers from various vessels in the Armada that had gone ashore just that morning, attacked where the land and sea faces of the fort met. So this was a 2-pronged ground assault against Fort Fisher late on the afternoon of January the 15th. After 5.5 hours of heavy hand-to-hand fighting, the Confederates were forced to abandon the fort. They had been underground for the better part of 2.5 days during the naval bombardment. They could come out only occasionally to fire their guns, but they couldn't cook meals, they couldn't bury their dead, and then they had to come out and fight not as artillerymen, but as infantry. And they were outnumbered, exhausted, overwhelmed, and still they put up a dogged defense. But after 5.5 hours of hand-to-hand fighting, they were forced to relinquish and the fort was captured. Both Colonel Lamb and General Whiting, who again had gone there as an advisor and volunteer combatant, were captured. And about 10 o'clock that night, General Whiting was captured along with Lamb. And Whiting later wrote, "They have got us, boys, but you have done your duty." And by the way, Whiting would end up in a prisoner of military prison on Governor's Island, New York, where he would die on March 10th, 1865, and on his deathbed wrote a scathing denunciation of Braxton Bragg for his incompetence and imbecility. Of course, no investigation was made against Bragg because, of course, the war ended only a month later. As a sad bookend to the largest combined Union operation of the war at Fort Fisher was the explosion of Fort Fisher's main powder magazine that killed or buried alive about 140 men on both sides, soldiers, sailors, and Marines. It was just a tragedy that could have been avoided, but that occurred the morning after the fort's fall. Well, Braxton Bragg was befuddled that Fort Fisher had fallen when it had survived that first attack in December. He immediately telegraphed Richmond that the fort had been captured, and President Davis immediately replied, "Counterattack, recapture the fort. Wilmington must remain open." But Bragg refused to do that, upholding his reputation for being not a fighting general, but instead evacuated the forts at the mouth of the river and at Smithville, modern Southport, and withdrew them upstream to Fort Anderson, and directly across the river from that was Sugarloaf Hill, and a line of defenses that had been constructed in the fall of '64 to prevent a Union landing. But they were unmanned when the Federals returned in mid-January. So now there are 4,500 Confederate troops under Major General Robert F. Hoke at Sugarloaf, and directly across the river at Fort Anderson, there were about 2,300 Confederate troops, and the idea was that now they would contest an advance on Wilmington. Well, what good was Wilmington now that blockade runners cannot get into the harbor way and up the Cape Fear River to unload their vital supplies? But Braxton Bragg now determined to hold on to the city. Admiral Porter was just as determined to capture it, pushed through the inlets a flotilla of almost 30 vessels for operations on the Cape Fear River. Remember, Wilmington is the objective, to capture the city, the river, and the railroads in support of General Sherman's northern expedition. General Grant was so determined to capture Wilmington that on January the 28th, he came down from Virginia to the Cape Fear River to parley with Admiral Porter and General Terry on board Porter's flagship, the Malvern, on the best way to capture Wilmington. So Grant himself, it's the only time I think that Grant ever came to the Cape Fear, was there to plan the assault on Wilmington. Reinforcements were brought down from Alexandria and Washington, led by Major General John M. Schofield of the 23rd Army Corps that had been doing heavy fighting in Tennessee earlier that autumn. This 23rd Army Corps contingent would reinforce the badly bloodied but successful Union troops that had captured Fort Fisher. So they are now reinforced. They are organizing and planning an attack on the city of Wilmington, moving up both sides of the Cape Fear River, while Admiral Porter's flotilla would provide covering fire for the wings from the riverside. But on February 10th, the day before Union forces began their advance against the Tar Heel Seaport, General Bragg departed Wilmington for Richmond, where he was summoned to reorganize his military staff. showing his total indifference to Wilmington's fate. Major General Hope, whose division again Lee had dispatched from Virginia to keep Wilmington in Confederate hands, would now assume field command and defense of the seaport. So he made his field headquarters at Sugarloaf, and directly across would be Fort Anderson. But Union forces are now going to move up the east side of the Cape Fear River, led by United States colored troops, while General Schofield's contingent would go against Fort Anderson, which was the largest obstacle between Union forces and Wilmington. Major General Jacob D. Cox led a division of blue uniform troops from Fort Fisher across the Cape Fear River to Smithville for the advance against Fort Anderson, which even Grant had said, you know, the capture of Wilmington is the best and only thing that can be done. And after listening to General Terry and Admiral Porter, who said our last major obstacle will be Fort Anderson, Grant authorized the attack on Wilmington by way of Fort Anderson. And so February 17th, 19th, roughly a month after the fall of Fort Fisher, Admiral Porter's flotilla would bombard Fort Anderson for 2.5 days, while General Cox's forces moved up against the fort to demonstrate from the south, but then sent 2 brigades of troops around the west end of Wharton Pond to outflank the fort. Like Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson was a 2-sided work, and its weakness was on the north side. It was not a bastion, but a 2-sided work, so it could be attacked from the north, which is what federal forces were now positioning themselves to do. And the Confederates, with a heavy bombardment by naval flotilla from the river and 2 brigades of Union troops in their front, and now Union forces positioning themselves to the northwest, Fort Anderson was evacuated. How important was the fall of Fort Anderson? Well, this says it all. New York Herald, the most important newspaper in the country at the time, headlines, the capture of Fort Anderson. But what was front page news in February of '65 became back page news as more stirring and important events unfolded in the final days of the war. General Hope withdrew his forces up the east side of the Cape Fear River, while Confederate forces were retreating towards Wilmington on the west side. There was heavy skirmishing throughout the day on February 19th and 20th. United States colored troops led the advance against Wilmington on the east side of the Cape Fear River. They were in the vanguard and fought hard and fought well, particularly at the Battle of Forks Road, about 3 miles south of Wilmington on February 20th and 21st. This is where the Confederates made their last stand. General Terry was determined to push through this Forks Road position to capture Wilmington, and he depended on United States colored troops to do that for him. They were unsuccessful in breaching the Confederate defenses, but the fighting was intense. And incidentally, this was a brother against brother aspect of the war was seen at the Battle of Forks Road, where Confederate Corporal Hosey Lewis Horn of the Wilmington Horse Artillery fought against his brother Jacob, who was a scout with General Terry's Provisional Corps. So this was literally a brother against brother aspect of the war as seen in the Wilmington Campaign. Well, Braxton Bragg returned to Wilmington on February the 21st, only to see Union troops now on the heights of Belleville, just on the west side of the Cape Fear River, and General Hoke's brigades just south of Wilmington under heavy pressure. And so he ordered the evacuation of Wilmington and the retreat of his army into the interior of North Carolina to join with other Confederate armies that are being pushed northward by the advance of General Sherman, who captured Columbia and then moved on to Fayetteville. And William T's army was in desperate trouble, and of course taking command would be Joseph Johnston. But Wilmington was, according to one Confederate soldier's observation, the last rays of departing hope for the Confederacy. He was a Wilmington native, William Calder, and as they trudged through the darkened streets, retreating northward early in the pre-dawn hours of that day, Calder said, "I could see lights shining from a few residences in Wilmington." but for the most part, it was a darkened city. And these lights appeared to me to be the last rays of departing hope. And so it was very symbolic, because the capture of Wilmington, the fall of Wilmington, was indeed the last rays of departing hope for the Confederacy. Blockade running had been severed. No longer could vital supplies get into Wilmington and then sent up the Wilmington Railroad to Lee's army, the lifeline of the Confederacy. There would be one final showdown by General Joseph Johnston's army and the army from Wilmington under Braxton Bragg at the Battle of Bentonville on March 19th, 21st through the 21st, 1865, the largest land battle in North Carolina during the war. But then, only 46 days after the fall of Wilmington, as he had predicted if it fell, Lee was forced to surrender after abandoning his defenses at Petersburg. He retreated westward, only to be pursued by General U.S. Grant, whose army caught Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. And on April the 9th, Lee surrendered to U.S. Grant. 2 weeks later, General Joseph Johnston capitulated to William Sherman at Durham Station, North Carolina, and the effective fighting of the war came to a close. So that's the role that Wilmington played in final military operations, and it was indeed the last rays of departing hope for the Confederacy when the Tar Heel seaport fell. Thank you very much.